Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. In the quiet hours of the early morning, when most of Salt Lake City lay sleeping, a young woman made what would become her final journey home. This is the story of McKenzie Lueck, a 23-year-old University of Utah student whose life was cut tragically short in June 2019. It's a case that would captivate the nation, reveal the hidden dangers of modern dating culture, and ultimately bring justice through the tireless work of dedicated investigators. McKenzie's story begins not with her disappearance, but with the vibrant life she was building for herself. In Utah, born and raised in El Segundo, California, she had traveled far from home to pursue her dreams of becoming a kinesiologist. Those who knew her described a young woman full of ambition, someone who balanced her academic pursuits with work and an active social life. She was just 1 year away from graduation, her future stretching ahead of her with endless possibilities. But like many young people in the digital age, McKenzie navigated a complex world of online relationships and modern dating platforms. She had been open about her involvement in what she called the sugar baby lifestyle, using platforms like Seeking Arrangement to connect with older, financially established men. To some, this might seem like a cautionary tale about the dangers of such arrangements, but the truth is more complex and ultimately more tragic. Our story truly begins on June 15, 2019, when McKenzie received devastating news. Her beloved grandmother had passed away, and she needed to return home to California immediately for the funeral. This was a woman who had helped shape McKenzie's life, and her loss hit the young student hard. Without hesitation, she booked a flight from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles, temporarily setting aside her studies and work commitments to be with her family during this difficult time. The funeral was held on June 16th. A somber affair where family members gathered to say their final goodbyes. McKenzie, ever the devoted granddaughter, stayed as long as she could, offering comfort to her parents and other relatives. But she had responsibilities back in Utah, classes to attend, work shifts to cover, and a life that couldn't be put on hold indefinitely. That evening, she made her way to Los Angeles International Airport, her carry-on bag packed with the few items she had brought for the brief trip. She had texted several friends and family members throughout the day, letting them know she would be returning to Salt Lake City that night. Her flight, Southwest Airlines 4842, was scheduled to arrive at Salt Lake City International Airport at 1:35 a.m. on June 17th. The flight proceeded without incident. McKenzie, like many frequent travelers, probably used the time to catch up on messages, maybe scroll through social media, or simply rest after the emotional toll of the funeral. She had no way of knowing that someone was already making plans for her arrival. Someone who had been communicating with her through the Seeking Arrangement platform. At 1:35 a.m., Flight 4842 touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport. The terminal was largely empty at that hour, populated mainly by tired travelers and airport staff working the overnight shift. McKenzie retrieved her luggage and, as was her habit, sent a quick text to her parents letting them know she had landed safely. It was a simple message, the kind that millions of adult children send to worried parents every day. "I'm here. Made it safe." Those would be the last words her parents would ever hear from their daughter. What happened next would become one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Instead of taking a taxi, using a ride-share service to go directly home, or calling one of her friends for a ride, McKenzie had made arrangements to meet someone. At approximately 2:11 a.m., she requested a Lyft ride, but not to her apartment or anywhere near the University of Utah campus where she lived and studied. Instead, her destination was Hatch Park in North Salt Lake, a small neighborhood park that would have been completely deserted at that hour. The Lyft driver, following the GPS directions provided by the app, had no reason to question the unusual destination. He picked up a young woman who seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little tired from her flight, but otherwise unremarkable. She was quiet during the ride, perhaps texting on her phone, or simply looking out the window at the empty streets. The park itself was nothing special, just a small community space with some playground equipment, a few trees, and limited lighting. At 3 a.m., it was the kind of place where absolutely nothing should have been happening. The Lyft driver dropped McKenzie off near the park and drove away, completing what seemed like just another routine late-night fare. But McKenzie wasn't alone in that park. Someone was waiting for her. Investigators would later discover that she had been in communication with a man named Iana Sawyer, whom she had met on the seeking arrangement platform. Their text messages showed that they had been planning to meet, though the exact nature of their arrangement would remain unclear. What is certain is that at approximately 3 a.m. on June 17, 2019, McKenzie Lueck got into a vehicle with Iana Sawyer and left Hatch Park. She would never be seen alive again. When McKenzie failed to show up for work later that day, her friends initially weren't too concerned. She had just returned from a funeral and might have simply decided to take an extra day to rest and recover. College students, after all, sometimes miss work or skip classes for various reasons. But as the hours turned into days, the concern began to grow. McKenzie was known to be responsible and communicative. She kept in regular contact with her friends and family, and it was completely unlike her to simply disappear without explanation. Her roommates noted that she hadn't returned to their shared apartment, and her bed appeared not to have been slept in. Her car remained parked where she had left it before traveling to California. By June 20th, 3 days after she was supposed to have returned, her friends knew something was seriously wrong. They contacted the Salt Lake City Police Department to report her missing. The initial response was unfortunately typical of missing person cases involving young adults. Police often assume that people in their 20s have simply decided to take an impromptu trip or are staying with friends without informing everyone of their whereabouts. But McKenzie's friends persisted. They provided police with her flight information, her work schedule, and her phone number. They emphasized that this behavior was completely out of character for someone who was generally very responsible about communicating with others. They also mentioned that she had been using dating apps and might have met someone new, though they didn't have specific details about who that might be. Her parents, Greg and Diana Leake, were contacted in California. The news that their daughter was missing came as a devastating shock, particularly so soon after the loss of Mackenzie's grandmother. They had spoken with her regularly and knew she had planned to return to Salt Lake City immediately after the funeral. The fact that she had texted them upon landing made her subsequent disappearance even more mysterious and frightening. Detective Mike Brown of the Salt Lake City Police Department was assigned to the case. An experienced investigator, Brown understood that the first 48 hours in a missing person case are critical, and those hours had already passed. However, he also knew that each day that went by would make finding McKenzie more difficult. The investigation began with the basics, reconstructing McKenzie's last known movements. Police obtained her phone records and discovered that her phone had stopped transmitting data shortly after 3 a.m. on June 17th. This was significant because it suggested that either the phone had been turned off, had run out of battery, or had been damaged or destroyed. They traced her flight records and confirmed that she had indeed arrived at Salt Lake City International Airport as scheduled. Security cameras at the airport showed her walking through the terminal, appearing normal and unhurried. She retrieved her luggage and made her way to the ground transportation area. The breakthrough came when investigators obtained records from Lyft. They discovered that McKenzie had indeed requested a ride from the airport, but not to her home or any location that made obvious sense. The destination was Hatch Park in North Salt Lake, and the ride had been completed at approximately 3 a.m. This revelation shifted the entire focus of the investigation. Why would a young woman, returning from a red-eye flight after attending her grandmother's funeral, arrange to meet someone at a park in the middle of the night? Police knew this had to be connected to her disappearance, but they still didn't know who she had gone to meet. The answer would come from her digital footprint. Investigators obtained a warrant for McKenzie's phone and social media accounts, and what they discovered opened up an entirely new avenue of investigation. She had been active on Seeking Arrangement, a platform that connects young women with older, financially established men. Her profile described her as someone seeking mutually beneficial relationships, and she had been in communication with several different men. One name appeared repeatedly in her recent messages: Iana Sawyer. Ayula Ajayi was a 31-year-old information technology worker who lived in Salt Lake City's Fair Park neighborhood. On paper, he seemed unremarkable, an immigrant from Nigeria who had come to the United States to pursue education and career opportunities. He worked in tech support, lived in a modest house, and appeared to lead a relatively quiet life. But his digital communications with McKenzie told a different story. Through painstaking analysis of phone records and social media messages, investigators were able to piece together a timeline of their relationship. They had been communicating through the seeking arrangement platform for several weeks before McKenzie's disappearance. Their messages suggested they had met in person at least once before, and Ajayi had been pushing for another meeting. Most significantly, the communication between them continued right up until the early morning hours of June 17th. The last messages showed them coordinating to meet at Hatch Park, with Ajayi providing specific instructions about where and when to meet. After 3:00 a.m. that morning, Mackenzie's phone went silent. Detective Brown and his team now had a suspect and a timeline, but they needed more evidence before they could make an arrest. They began surveillance of Ajayi's home and started gathering background information about him. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Ajayi had a history of concerning behavior toward women. There were reports of aggressive and controlling behavior in previous relationships, and investigators would later discover that he was facing charges in connection with another case involving the alleged kidnapping and sexual assault of a different woman in 2018. But the most damning evidence would come from his own backyard. As the investigation focused on Ayula Ajayi, the search for McKenzie continued to expand. Her disappearance had captured public attention, particularly in the Salt Lake City area where she was known and loved by many. The University of Utah community rallied around her family, organizing search parties and spreading awareness through social media. Her parents traveled from California to Utah to assist in the search efforts. They held press conferences, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. They described their daughter as a loving, ambitious young woman who had simply been trying to balance her education with the realities of supporting herself financially. They made it clear that they didn't judge her lifestyle choices and only wanted her to come home safely. The media coverage was extensive, and with local and national news outlets picking up the story. Mackenzie's photograph, a beautiful young woman with a bright smile, appeared on television screens and newspaper front pages across the country. The case seemed to touch a nerve with the public, perhaps because it highlighted the dangers that young people, particularly young women, face in the era of online dating and social media connections. As the days turned into weeks, the search became increasingly desperate. Volunteers combed through parks, canyons, and remote areas around Salt Lake City. Police used helicopters and specialized search teams to cover ground that would be impossible to search on foot. Every tip, no matter how seemingly insignificant, was investigated. But investigators knew that their best hope of finding McKenzie lay in building a case against Ayula Ajayi. They were conducting round-the-clock surveillance of his movements and communications, looking for any evidence that might lead them to her location or provide proof of what had happened to her. The breakthrough would come from an unexpected source: his neighbors. In the days following Mackenzie's disappearance, investigators had been quietly canvassing Ayula Ajayi's neighborhood, asking residents if they had noticed anything unusual around the time of June 17th. Most had nothing significant to report. It was a quiet residential area where people generally kept to themselves. But one neighbor's account would prove crucial to the investigation. This neighbor recalled seeing Ajayi in his backyard on June 17th and 18th, engaged in what appeared to be a sustained burning project. The neighbor remembered it clearly because the smell was unpleasant and persistent, unlike the typical yard waste or barbecue activities that might produce smoke in a residential area. There had been a strong odor of gasoline and burning materials that had lasted for hours. The neighbor also remembered seeing Ajayi making multiple trips between his house and the backyard, carrying what appeared to be various items to feed the fire. At the time, it had seemed odd, but not necessarily suspicious. People burn yard waste and old household items all the time. But in the context of a missing person investigation focused on Ajayi, the timing became incredibly significant. When investigators presented this information to a judge, they had enough for a search warrant. On June 26, 2019, 9 days after Mackenzie's disappearance, a team of investigators descended on Ajayi's property with cadaver dogs and forensic equipment. What they found in his backyard would confirm their worst fears. The search of Ayula Ajayi's property began in the early morning hours of June 26. Investigators knew they were looking for evidence of foul play, but they hoped against hope that they might still find McKenzie alive, perhaps being held somewhere on the property. Those hopes were quickly dashed. In Ajayi's backyard, investigators found an area where there had clearly been sustained, intense burning. The burn pit contained the charred remains of what appeared to be personal items. Forensic specialists carefully sifted through the debris, documenting and collecting every fragment that might provide evidence. Among the burned materials, they found items that Mackenzie's family would later identify as belonging to her. Pieces of jewelry, parts of her cell phone, and fragments of clothing that matched what she had been wearing when she left California. But the most damning evidence came when the cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human remains in the burn pit. Subsequent forensic analysis would confirm that tissue found in the burned debris matched Mackenzie's DNA. The realization hit investigators like a physical blow. They were no longer searching for a missing person. They were now investigating a homicide. Ayula Ajayi was taken into custody that evening. As officers led him away in handcuffs, he maintained his innocence, claiming that he had no knowledge of what had happened to McKenzie Lueck. But the evidence found in his backyard told a different story. The arrest provided some measure of closure to Mackenzie's family and friends, but it also raised new questions. If human tissue had been found in the burn pit, where was the rest of Mackenzie's body? Investigators knew that Ajayi had to have disposed of her remains somewhere else, and they were determined to find her and provide her family with the ability to lay her to rest properly. The search for Mackenzie's remains would lead investigators on a grim journey through the remote areas surrounding Salt Lake City. Following Ajayi's arrest, investigators intensified their efforts to locate Mackenzie's body. They knew from the evidence found in his backyard that he had attempted to burn her remains, but the amount of material found there suggested that most of her body had been disposed of elsewhere. Detectives began the painstaking process of retracing Ajayi's movements in the days following June 17th. They analyzed his cell phone data, credit card transactions, and vehicle records to determine where he might have gone. They also conducted extensive interviews with anyone who might have had contact with him during that time period. The investigation revealed that in the days after Mackenzie's murder, Ajayi had made several trips to remote areas outside of Salt Lake City. Cell phone tower data showed that his phone had been in various locations in the canyons and mountainous areas surrounding the city, often during overnight hours when such travel would be unusual. One location that appeared repeatedly in the data was Logan Canyon, a remote area about 80 miles north of Salt Lake City. It's a rugged, sparsely populated region that would provide an ideal location for someone trying to dispose of evidence without being observed. On July 3, 2019, investigators began searching Logan Canyon. The area is vast and challenging to navigate, with steep terrain, dense vegetation, and numerous remote locations where someone could hide evidence. The search required specialized teams with expertise in wilderness recovery operations. The search was methodical and heartbreaking. Investigators knew they were looking for the remains of a young woman who had simply been trying to make her way home after saying goodbye to her grandmother. The contrast between the natural beauty of the canyon and the grim purpose of their search was not lost on anyone involved. Late in the day on July 3rd, searchers made the discovery that everyone had been dreading, but expecting hidden in a remote area of Logan Canyon. They found Mackenzie's remains. The condition of the body confirmed the prosecutor's worst suspicions about the brutal nature of her murder. The discovery of Mackenzie's remains allowed the coroner to determine the cause of death, providing crucial evidence for the prosecution's case against Ayula Ajayi. What investigators learned was both shocking and heartbreaking. Mackenzie had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and her body was found with her arms bound behind her back. This evidence painted a picture of a brutal, premeditated attack that had been carried out with shocking violence. The binding of her arms suggested that she had been restrained, possibly tortured before being killed. This detail would haunt her family and friends, as it indicated that her final moments had been filled with terror and pain. The blunt force trauma to her head showed that her attacker had used significant violence to end her life. For the prosecutors building their case against Ajayi, this evidence was crucial. It demonstrated that this was not a crime of passion or an accident that had gone wrong. The premeditation involved in restraining the victim, the violence of the attack, and the elaborate cover-up that followed all pointed to a calculated, cold-blooded murder. The condition and location of the remains also provided insight into Ajalaicha's actions after the murder. The fact that he had transported her body more than 80 miles from his home to dispose of it in a remote canyon showed the lengths to which he had gone to try to conceal his crime. For Mackenzie's family, learning the details of how their daughter had died was devastating. They had spent weeks hoping against hope that she might still be alive, that perhaps she was being held somewhere and could still be rescued. The reality that she had been murdered so brutally and so soon after they had last spoken with her was almost impossible to bear. With Mackenzie's remains recovered and the cause of death established, prosecutors moved forward with formal charges against Ayula Ajayi. The charges reflected the severity and premeditated nature of the crime: aggravated murder, aggravated kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and desecration of a body. The aggravated murder charge carried the possibility of the death penalty, reflecting prosecutors' belief that this was an especially heinous crime that warranted the most severe punishment available under Utah law. The additional charges painted a picture of a defendant who had not only committed murder, but had gone to extraordinary lengths to cover up his crime and obstruct the investigation. Ajayi's defense team faced a challenging case. The physical evidence linking their client to the crime was overwhelming. Mackenzie's remains found in his burn pit, her personal items discovered among the burned debris, the cell phone data placing him in Logan Canyon where her body was found, and the witness testimony about the sustained burning in his backyard immediately after her disappearance. Perhaps recognizing the strength of the evidence against him, Ajayi's legal strategy seemed to focus more on avoiding the death penalty than on maintaining his innocence. His attorneys explored the possibility of a plea agreement that would result in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. For Mackenzie's family, the legal proceedings represented a chance for justice, but they also meant reliving the trauma of her death over and over again. Every court hearing brought new details about what had happened to their daughter, and each revelation was like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. The case also brought to light disturbing details about Ajayi's past behavior. Another woman came forward to accuse him of sexual assault in a separate incident from 2018, suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior toward women he met through online platforms. Throughout the investigation and subsequent media coverage, much attention was focused on Mackenzie's involvement in what she had described as the sugar baby lifestyle. She had met Ajayi on the site seeking arrangement, which bills itself as a way for wealthy sugar daddies to meet women known as sugar babies. This aspect of the case sparked considerable public debate and unfortunately led to some victim-blaming commentary, suggesting that Mackenzie had somehow brought her fate upon herself by participating in these types of relationships. Her family and friends were quick to push back against such characterizations, emphasizing that no one deserves to be murdered regardless of their lifestyle choices. Mackenzie's involvement in the sugar baby lifestyle reflected the financial pressures facing many college students in America today. Tuition costs, living expenses, and the desire to graduate without crushing debt lead many young people to explore alternative ways of supporting themselves through school. For some, platforms like Seeking Arrangements seem to offer a solution that allows them to maintain their studies while having their financial needs met. The tragedy of Mackenzie's case is that she was trying to be responsible about her situation. She was a year away from graduation with a degree in kinesiology that would have provided her with career opportunities and financial independence. She was simply trying to bridge the gap between her current situation and her future goals. Her family made it clear that they didn't judge her choices, and that they only wanted her to be safe and happy. They emphasized that she was a loving, intelligent young woman who was working hard to build a better life for herself. The focus on her lifestyle choices also overshadowed the real issue at the heart of the case: a predator who used online platforms to target and murder a vulnerable young woman. Regardless of how Mackenzie and Ajayi met, the responsibility for her death lay entirely with the person who chose to kill her. As the legal proceedings continued, it became increasingly clear that the evidence against Ayula Ajayi was overwhelming. His defense team faced the challenge of trying to save their client's life in the face of evidence that clearly demonstrated his guilt. In October 2020, Ajayi pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and desecration of a human body as part of a plea deal. The agreement removed the possibility of the death penalty and instead sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many observers, the plea agreement represented a pragmatic resolution to a case where the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was so strong that a trial would likely have resulted in a conviction anyway, and the plea deal spared Mackenzie's family from having to endure the additional trauma of a lengthy trial with all its painful details and legal maneuvering. The plea also meant that Ajayi would spend the rest of his life in prison, ensuring that he would never have the opportunity to harm another person. While some might have preferred to see him face the death penalty, the life sentence guaranteed that justice would be served without the years of appeals and legal uncertainty that typically accompany capital cases. At the sentencing hearing, Mackenzie's family members had the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements, allowing them to speak directly to Ajayi about the impact his actions had on their lives. Their words were powerful and heartbreaking, describing the loss of a daughter, sister, and friend who had been taken from them far too soon. They spoke about the dreams that would never be fulfilled, the milestones that would never be celebrated, and the grandchildren who would never be born. They described the ongoing pain of losing Mackenzie and how her murder had fundamentally changed their lives forever. The murder of McKenzie Lueck had far-reaching impacts beyond just her immediate family and friends. The case highlighted the potential dangers of online dating platforms, particularly those that facilitate relationships with significant power imbalances between the participants. In the wake of her death, there were renewed calls for better safety measures on dating platforms, including more thorough background checks for users and better education about potential risks. Some advocates argued for stronger verification processes and more robust safety features to help protect vulnerable users. The case also sparked conversations about the sugar baby lifestyle and the broader economic pressures that lead young people to participate in these arrangements. While some focused on judging the lifestyle itself, others pointed out that the real issue was addressing the underlying economic inequality that makes such arrangements seem necessary to many students. For the University of Utah community, Mackenzie's death was a profound loss. She had been an active and well-liked member of the campus community, and her murder sent shockwaves through the student body. The university implemented additional safety measures and educational programs aimed at helping students make informed decisions about online dating and personal safety. Her death also had a lasting impact on the investigation techniques used by the Salt Lake City Police Department. The successful use of digital forensics, cell phone data analysis, and cadaver dogs in solving the case provided valuable experience that would be applied to future investigations. Perhaps most importantly, Mackenzie's case served as a reminder of the very real dangers that exist in our modern, digitally connected world. While online platforms have created new opportunities for people to meet and form relationships, they have also created new avenues for predators to find and target victims. In the end, it's important that Mackenzie Lueck be remembered, not as a victim of a brutal crime, but as a vibrant young woman who was building a life full of promise and possibility. She was a devoted daughter and granddaughter, a loyal friend, and a dedicated student who was working hard to achieve her goals. She had dreams of becoming a kinesiologist and helping others through her work in physical therapy and rehabilitation. She loved spending time with her family and friends, and she approached her challenges with determination and optimism. She was someone who cared deeply about others and who worked hard to support herself while pursuing her education. The tragedy of her death is not just that a life was lost, but that so many possibilities were cut short. She never got to graduate from college, never got to start her career, never got to find lasting love, never got to have children of her own. All of those futures were stolen from her by someone who saw her not as a human being, with hopes and dreams, but as an object to be used and disposed of. Her family established a foundation in her memory that focuses on supporting young women who are working to achieve their educational and career goals. Through this foundation, Mackenzie's legacy lives on in the lives of other young women who are able to pursue their dreams because of the support they receive. Her story also serves as a reminder to all of us to look out for one another, particularly those who might be vulnerable or isolated. If we can learn anything from her tragedy, it should be the importance of staying connected to our loved ones and being aware of the risks that exist in our modern world. The murder of Mackenzie Lueck occurred during a time of increasing awareness about violence against women, particularly violence perpetrated by men who meet their victims through online platforms. Her case became part of a larger conversation about how society can better protect women from predatory behavior. The case also highlighted the challenges facing law enforcement in the digital age. Investigators had to navigate complex privacy laws and technical challenges to access the digital evidence that proved crucial to solving the case. The successful resolution of the investigation demonstrated the importance of having law enforcement officers who are trained in digital forensics and familiar with the various online platforms that criminals might use. For parents of college-age children, McKenzie's case served as a sobering reminder of the importance of staying connected with their adult children and being aware of the challenges they face. While parents must respect their children's independence and privacy, maintaining open lines of communication can be crucial in helping young adults navigate potentially dangerous situations. The case also raised important questions about the responsibility of online platforms to protect their users. While companies cannot be held responsible for the criminal actions of their users, there are legitimate questions about what steps they should take to verify identities, conduct background checks, and provide safety resources to help users make informed decisions. As we reach the end of this story, it's natural to feel a sense of sadness and frustration. McKenzie Lueck was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, someone who was working hard to build a future for herself and help others along the way. Her death was senseless and brutal, perpetrated by someone who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity rather than recognizing her humanity. The investigation that followed her disappearance showed the best of what law enforcement can accomplish when dedicated professionals work tirelessly to seek justice. Detective Mike Brown and his team never gave up on finding McKenzie, and their thorough investigation ensured that her killer would be held accountable for his actions. The resolution of the case provided some measure of closure for her family and friends, but it could never truly heal the wound left by her loss. No amount of justice can bring back a daughter, sister, or friend who has been taken too soon. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to McKenzie's memory is to remember her not as a victim, but as a young woman who was trying to make her way in the world with courage and determination. She faced financial challenges and made difficult choices, but she never stopped working toward her goals. She maintained close relationships with her family and friends, and she approached her life with optimism despite the obstacles she faced. Her story serves as a reminder that behind every true crime case is a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. McKenzie Lueck was more than just a news headline or a case study in criminal behavior. She was a human being whose life mattered, whose dreams were valid, and whose memory deserves to be honored. In the quiet hours of the night, when we remember those who have been taken from us too soon, we can honor McKenzie by committing ourselves to building a world where young people can pursue their dreams without fear, where women can navigate relationships without becoming victims, and where the vulnerable among us are protected rather than exploited. Rest in peace, McKenzie Lueck. Your life mattered, your dreams were valid, you will not be forgotten. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The evening air in Austin, Texas carried the familiar warmth of May 2022. Across the city, cyclists were preparing for the upcoming Gravel Locos race, a grueling 150-mile endurance event that would test even the most seasoned riders. Among those preparing was a young woman whose star was rapidly rising in the competitive cycling world. Anna Moriah Wilson, known to everyone simply as Mo. At 25 years old, Mo Wilson had already established herself as a force to be reckoned with in gravel racing. Her athletic prowess was matched only by her warm personality and infectious enthusiasm for the sport she loved. Friends described her as someone who lit up every room she entered, with a genuine smile and an unwavering dedication to pushing the boundaries of what was possible on two wheels. Mo had traveled from her home in San Francisco to Austin specifically for the Gravel Locos race. It was the kind of event that drew elite cyclists from across the country, a chance to test themselves against some of the most challenging terrain Texas had to offer. She was staying with a friend, Caitlin Cash, in an East Austin apartment, looking forward to what promised to be an exciting weekend of competition. But Mo Wilson would never make it to that starting line. On the evening of May 11th, 2022, as the sun began its descent over Austin, Mo made plans to spend some time with Colin Strickland, a prominent figure in the professional cycling community. Strickland was well known in Austin cycling circles. A successful racer who had built a reputation not just for his athletic achievements, but also for his involvement in various cycling-related business ventures. The relationship between Mo Wilson and Colin Strickland was complicated, layered with history that would ultimately prove deadly. They had first met months earlier at a 3-day gravel race in Idaho. What started as a professional relationship between two elite athletes had briefly evolved into something more personal during a period when Strickland was separated from his longtime girlfriend. That girlfriend was Caitlin Marie Armstrong, a 34-year-old yoga instructor and licensed real estate agent who had been in an on-and-off relationship with Strickland for several years. Armstrong lived a life that appeared, from the outside, to be carefully curated and successful. She taught yoga classes, worked in real estate, and had even partnered with Strickland in a vintage trailer renovation business they called Wheelhouse. To many who knew her casually, she seemed to embody the kind of wellness-focused lifestyle that was popular in Austin's health-conscious community. But beneath this seemingly serene exterior, Armstrong harbored deep insecurities and a capacity for jealousy that those closest to her had begun to recognize as troubling. Her relationship with Strickland had been described by those who witnessed it as tumultuous, marked by periods of separation and reconciliation that seemed to follow a predictable pattern. During one of these separations, approximately 6 months before Mo Wilson's death, Strickland had begun what he would later describe as a brief romantic relationship with Wilson. According to Strickland's own account, this relationship lasted about a week and occurred during a time when he and Armstrong were not together. When Strickland and Armstrong eventually reconciled, the romantic aspect of his relationship with Wilson ended, but they remained friends and continued to communicate. This ongoing friendship would prove to be a source of constant irritation for Armstrong. Even though the romantic relationship between Strickland and Wilson had ended, Armstrong couldn't shake her suspicions and resentment. She monitored Strickland's communications obsessively, and the fact that he continued to maintain contact with Wilson gnawed at her constantly. By May 2022, Strickland described his relationship with Armstrong as having reached a period of relative stability. They were living together temporarily after Armstrong's apartment had been damaged in a storm, and they continued to work together on their trailer renovation business. To outside observers, it might have seemed that they had worked through their previous difficulties, but Armstrong's jealousy regarding Wilson had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified and crystallized into something darker and more dangerous. On the afternoon of May 11, 2022, Colin Strickland and Mo Wilson spent several hours together in Austin. They went swimming at Deep Eddy Pool, one of Austin's beloved spring-fed swimming holes, and afterward grabbed a meal at Pool Burger, a local restaurant. It was the kind of casual afternoon that friends might spend together, relaxed, unhurried, enjoying the warm Texas weather before the intensity of race weekend began. What Strickland didn't immediately realize was that Armstrong had been monitoring his activities, through methods that would later be revealed in court. She had discovered that he was spending time with Wilson. The knowledge that the woman she viewed as a threat was not only in Austin, but was actively spending time with her boyfriend, triggered something in Armstrong that went far beyond ordinary jealousy. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Strickland drove Wilson back to Caitlin Cash's apartment in East Austin, where Wilson was staying. It was a short drive through neighborhoods that were rapidly gentrifying, filled with the kind of modest homes and small apartment complexes that had long characterized Austin's East Side. Strickland dropped Wilson off around 8:30 p.m., with plans to see her again at the race over the weekend. Wilson went inside the apartment, likely looking forward to a quiet evening before the big race. She may have been reviewing her strategy for the 50-mile course, checking her equipment one final time, or simply unwinding from what had been a pleasant day. The apartment was quiet. Cash wasn't home at the time, and Wilson settled in for what she expected to be a peaceful night. But Armstrong had not finished monitoring Strickland's activities. Somehow, she had tracked his movements throughout the day and had followed him to Cash's apartment. What happened next would be reconstructed through painstaking police investigation, witness testimony, and physical evidence that told a story of rage and calculated violence. Armstrong arrived at the apartment complex sometime after Strickland had left. Surveillance footage would later show her vehicle in the area during the crucial time period. She approached the apartment where she knew Wilson was staying and somehow gained access to the building. What transpired in those next few minutes would end one promising life and destroy several others. The details that emerged during the subsequent investigation painted a picture of an attack that was both sudden and brutal. Wilson, who had no reason to expect violence, was confronted by Armstrong in what would prove to be her final moments. Armstrong had brought a gun, a weapon that in a cruel irony had been purchased by Strickland himself. She fired multiple shots, striking Wilson with deadly accuracy. The attack was swift and efficient, suggesting that Armstrong had come prepared to kill, not merely to confront or threaten. When Caitlin Cash returned to her apartment around 10 p.m., she made a discovery that would haunt her forever. She found Mo Wilson's body on the bathroom floor. Surrounded by the aftermath of violent death, Cash immediately called 911, her voice breaking as she tried to explain to the dispatcher what she had found. The 911 call captured the raw shock and horror of the moment. Cash attempted CPR, desperately trying to revive her friend, but it was clear that Wilson had been dead for some time. When paramedics and police arrived, they confirmed what Cash already knew. Mo Wilson was gone. The Austin Police Department immediately launched a homicide investigation. The scene they encountered was both tragic and telling. Wilson had been shot multiple times, and the evidence suggested that this had not been a robbery or a random attack. Nothing appeared to be missing from the apartment, and there were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Wilson had either known her attacker or had been taken by surprise. Investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing Wilson's final day. They spoke with Caitlin Cash, who provided them with information about Wilson's activities and the people she had been in contact with. They reviewed surveillance footage from the apartment complex and surrounding areas. They examined Wilson's phone records and social media accounts. One name that emerged quickly in their investigation was Colin Strickland. As someone who had spent significant time with Wilson on the day of her death, he was an obvious person of interest. When detectives contacted him, Strickland was reportedly shocked and devastated by the news of Wilson's death. He cooperated fully with the investigation, providing details about their day together and his relationship with Wilson. But as investigators dug deeper into Strickland's background, another name emerged: Caitlin Armstrong. Complex dynamics of the relationship between Strickland, Armstrong, and Wilson began to come into focus, and a motive for the murder started to take shape. Detectives discovered that Armstrong had a history of jealousy regarding Strickland's relationship with Wilson. They found evidence of her monitoring his communications and activities. Most significantly, they began to uncover physical evidence that placed Armstrong at or near the scene of the crime. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex showed a vehicle matching the description of Armstrong's car in the area at the time of the murder. When investigators examined Armstrong's phone records, they found data suggesting that she had been tracking Strickland's movements on the day of the murder. The evidence painted a picture of premeditation and careful planning. But when Austin police attempted to locate Caitlin Armstrong for questioning, they discovered that she had vanished. Armstrong's disappearance added another layer of complexity to an already challenging investigation. In the crucial hours and days following Wilson's murder, when investigators were working to build their case and identify suspects, Armstrong had seemingly disappeared without a trace. The investigation revealed that Armstrong had left Austin shortly after the murder, but her exact whereabouts remained unknown. Her absence created a sense of urgency among investigators, who recognized that they were dealing not just with a murder suspect, but with someone who had demonstrated the capability for careful planning and deception. Austin police issued a warrant for Armstrong's arrest on charges of first-degree murder. The case began to attract national attention, partly because of the shocking nature of the crime, and partly because it involved figures from the professional cycling community. Mo Wilson's death sent ripples through the tight-knit world of competitive cycling, where athletes often knew each other across different disciplines and races. The U.S. Marshals Service took over the fugitive investigation, bringing their considerable resources and expertise to bear on tracking down Armstrong. Marshals investigators began tracing her movements after she left Austin, following a trail that would eventually lead them far from Texas. The search for Armstrong would prove to be international in scope, and would reveal the lengths to which she was willing to go to avoid capture. Using a combination of financial records, travel documents, and surveillance footage, marshals began to piece together Armstrong's movements after the murder. They discovered that Armstrong had used multiple identities and had taken deliberate steps to alter her appearance. She had obtained fake identification documents and had begun the process of creating an entirely new identity for herself. This wasn't the desperate flight of someone who had acted in a moment of passion. It was the calculated escape plan of someone who had thought carefully about how to evade capture. The trail led investigators to believe that Armstrong had fled the country, but determining her exact location proved challenging. She had covered her tracks carefully, using cash transactions when possible, and avoiding activities that might generate a clear paper trail. For 43 days, Caitlin Armstrong remained a fugitive. The search for her became an international manhunt, with U.S. Marshals coordinating with law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. The case remained in the headlines, with cycling communities and true crime followers closely following every development. The break in the case came when marshals identified Armstrong's location in Costa Rica. She had established herself in the beach town of Tamarindo, living under a false identity and attempting to build a new life for herself. She had changed her appearance significantly, altering her hair color and style in an apparent attempt to avoid recognition. But Armstrong's carefully constructed new identity began to unravel when marshals closed in on her location. On June 29, 2022, after weeks of surveillance and preparation, U.S. Marshals and Costa Rican authorities moved to arrest her. The arrest took place at a hostel in Santa Teresa, a popular destination for surfers and travelers seeking to escape to Costa Rica's Pacific coast. Armstrong was reportedly staying at the hostel under an assumed name, teaching yoga classes to other travelers, a detail that added an surreal element to her capture. When marshals approached Armstrong, she initially attempted to maintain her false identity, insisting that they had the wrong person. But fingerprint analysis quickly confirmed that she was indeed Caitlin Armstrong, the woman wanted for Mo Wilson's murder. The arrest marked the end of a manhunt that had spanned nearly 2 months in multiple countries. Armstrong was taken into custody and began the process of extradition back to the United States to face charges for Wilson's murder. During her time as a fugitive, additional details about the case had emerged. Investigators had continued to build their evidence, strengthening the case against Armstrong. The physical evidence placing her at the scene of the crime had been supplemented by witness testimony and additional forensic analysis. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence against Armstrong was the murder weapon itself. Investigators had determined that Wilson had been killed with a gun that had been purchased by Colin Strickland. This weapon, which Strickland had bought for their shared home, had somehow come into Armstrong's possession and been used to commit the murder. The revelation that Strickland had unknowingly provided the weapon used to kill Wilson added another tragic dimension to the case. Strickland found himself not only dealing with the guilt and trauma of having lost someone he cared about, but also with the knowledge that he had inadvertently provided the means for her murder. Armstrong's extradition from Costa Rica took several weeks to complete, as lawyers worked through the legal processes required to return her to the United States. When she finally arrived back in Austin, she was charged with first-degree murder and held on a $3.5 million bond. The case against Armstrong appeared strong. Prosecutors had surveillance footage placing her at the scene, evidence of her jealousy and threats against Wilson, and the murder weapon that could be traced back to her household. They also had testimony from Strickland and others who could speak to Armstrong's obsessive behavior regarding Wilson. But Armstrong's legal troubles were far from over. In a move that would add yet another dramatic chapter to an already extraordinary case, she managed to escape from custody while awaiting trial. On October 11, 2023, just 2 weeks before her trial was scheduled to begin, Armstrong escaped from the Travis County Jail during a medical transport. The escape occurred when Armstrong was being taken to a medical appointment outside the jail facility. She somehow managed to break free from her restraints and fled from the transport vehicle. The escape triggered another manhunt, though this one was much shorter than her original flight to Costa Rica. Armstrong remained at large for only a few hours before being recaptured. During her brief escape, she managed to cause injury to a correctional officer, which resulted in additional charges against her. The escape attempt revealed that Armstrong remained willing to take extreme risks to avoid facing trial for Wilson's murder. It also suggested that she had not accepted the inevitability of her situation, despite the substantial evidence against her. When Armstrong was recaptured, additional security measures were put in place to prevent any further escape attempts. She was returned to custody, and her trial was rescheduled to account for the delays caused by her escape. The trial of Caitlin Armstrong began in November 2023, more than a year and a half after Mo Wilson's murder. The proceedings took place in Travis County District Court in Austin, with Judge Brenda Kennedy presiding over the case. The prosecution, led by the Travis County District Attorney's Office, presented a methodical case against Armstrong. They detailed the timeline of events leading up to Wilson's murder, presented the physical evidence placing Armstrong at the scene, and called witnesses who testified about Armstrong's jealousy and threats regarding Wilson. Colin Strickland was a key witness for the prosecution. His testimony was emotionally difficult, as he was forced to recount his relationships with both Wilson and Armstrong, and to describe the events of May 11. Strickland testified about the tumultuous nature of his relationship with Armstrong, and confirmed that she had been aware of his previous romantic involvement with Wilson. Perhaps most damaging to Armstrong's defense was Strickland's testimony about her reaction to his relationship with Wilson. He described incidents where Armstrong had expressed intense jealousy and had made statements suggesting that she viewed Wilson as a threat to their relationship. The prosecution also presented surveillance footage that placed Armstrong's vehicle in the vicinity of the murder scene at the crucial time. Cell phone data showed that Armstrong had been tracking Strickland's movements on the day of the murder, supporting the theory that she had followed him to Cash's apartment. Ballistics evidence confirmed that Wilson had been killed with the gun that Strickland had purchased for their home. This weapon was missing from their residence after the murder, and prosecutors argued that Armstrong had taken it with the specific intention of killing Wilson. Armstrong's defense team faced the challenging task of countering what appeared to be overwhelming evidence. They argued that the evidence against their client was circumstantial and that the prosecution had not definitively proven that Armstrong was the killer. The defense suggested alternative theories for the crime, including the possibility that Wilson had been killed by someone else entirely. They questioned the reliability of the surveillance footage and challenged the prosecution's timeline of events. But perhaps most significantly, Armstrong's defense team had to contend with her behavior both before and after the murder. Her flight to Costa Rica and her attempt to create a new identity there suggested consciousness of guilt that was difficult to explain if she were innocent of the charges against her. The trial lasted 11 days, with prosecutors presenting witness after witness who testified about various aspects of the case. Caitlin Cash, who had discovered Wilson's body, provided emotional testimony about finding her friend dead. Other witnesses testified about Armstrong's behavior in the days and weeks before the murder, painting a picture of someone whose jealousy had escalated to dangerous levels. The jury, composed of 12 Travis County residents, listened to weeks of testimony and examined hundreds of pieces of evidence. They heard about the promise that Mo Wilson had shown as an athlete, the complex relationships that had led to her death, and the investigation that had spanned multiple countries. After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with their verdict. On November 16, 2023, they found Caitlin Armstrong guilty of the first-degree murder of Anna Mariah Wilson. The conviction brought a measure of justice for Wilson's family and friends, who had waited more than a year to see Armstrong held accountable for her actions. But the guilty verdict was only the first phase of the legal proceedings. The jury still had to determine Armstrong's sentence. In Texas, first-degree murder can carry a sentence of up to 99 years in prison or life imprisonment. The prosecution had chosen not to seek the death penalty, but they argued for a lengthy prison sentence that would ensure Armstrong would spend the rest of her life behind bars. During the sentencing phase, the jury heard victim impact statements from Wilson's family and friends. They spoke about the young woman they had lost, her dreams, her accomplishments, and the future that had been stolen from her. Wilson's parents, Karen and Eric, described the devastating impact of their daughter's death and their struggle to cope with the loss. The jury also heard testimony about Armstrong's background and character. While some witnesses spoke about positive aspects of her life, including her work as a yoga instructor and her involvement in community activities, these testimonials could not outweigh the gravity of her crime. After deliberating on the appropriate sentence, the jury returned with their decision. They sentenced Caitlin Armstrong to 90 years in prison for the murder of Mo Wilson. Under Texas law, Armstrong would be eligible for parole after serving 30 years, meaning she would be in her 60s before she could even be considered for release. The sentence represented one of the harshest penalties available under Texas law for first-degree murder. It reflected both the premeditated nature of the crime and the jury's conclusion that Armstrong posed a continuing danger to society. Armstrong's legal team immediately filed appeals, arguing that their client had not received a fair trial and challenging various aspects of the prosecution's case. However, these appeals were ultimately unsuccessful, and Armstrong's conviction and sentence were upheld. The conclusion of Armstrong's trial brought an end to a case that had captivated public attention for nearly 2 years. The murder of Mo Wilson had highlighted issues of domestic violence, stalking, and the dangerous potential of unchecked jealousy. It had also demonstrated the international reach of modern law enforcement and the difficulty of escaping justice in an interconnected world. For the cycling community, Wilson's death represented the loss of not just a talented athlete, but a beloved member of their extended family. Her murder had sent shockwaves through a community where athletes often knew each other personally, and where competition was balanced with mutual respect and friendship. Colin Strickland faced his own reckoning in the aftermath of the case. While he was not charged with any crime, his relationship with both Wilson and Armstrong had been central to the events that led to the murder. He lost sponsorship deals and faced significant backlash from parts of the cycling community who felt that he bore some responsibility for the tragedy. Strickland's situation highlighted the complex ways in which domestic violence can impact not just direct victims, but entire networks of family, friends, and colleagues. His decision to maintain a friendship with Wilson while in an on-and-off relationship with Armstrong had created the conditions that allowed Armstrong's jealousy to fester and ultimately explode into violence. The case also raised questions about the warning signs of domestic violence and stalking behavior. Armstrong's obsessive monitoring of Strickland's activities and her intense jealousy regarding Wilson were classic indicators of potentially dangerous behavior, but they had not been recognized as such until it was too late. In the months following Armstrong's conviction, Wilson's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, seeking to hold accountable not just Armstrong, but anyone else who might bear responsibility for their daughter's death. These civil proceedings represented another avenue for seeking justice and ensuring that all aspects of the case were thoroughly examined. The legacy of Mo Wilson extends beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. She was remembered as a rising star in cycling, someone who had the potential to achieve great things in her sport. More importantly, she was remembered as a kind, enthusiastic person who brought joy to everyone she met. Wilson's death served as a stark reminder of the prevalence of violence against women, particularly violence rooted in jealousy and possessiveness. Her case joined a long list of women who have been killed by individuals who could not accept the end of a relationship or the existence of perceived romantic rivals. For those who followed the case, Armstrong's conviction provided some measure of closure. Justice had been served, and the person responsible for Wilson's death would spend the rest of her life in prison. But no legal resolution could bring back the promising young athlete whose life had been cut short by an act of sense violence. The story of Mo Wilson's murder remains a cautionary tale about the dangerous potential of unchecked jealousy and obsession. It demonstrates how seemingly ordinary people can be capable of extraordinary violence when consumed by emotions they cannot control. As Armstrong began serving her 90-year sentence in a Texas state prison, the cycling world continued to remember Mo Wilson, not for how she died, but for how she lived. Her enthusiasm, talent, and kindness remained an inspiration to athletes and non-athletes alike, a reminder of the positive impact that one person can have on the lives of others. The case of Anna Maria Mo Wilson will long be remembered as one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory, a tragedy that revealed the dark side of human nature, while also demonstrating the resilience of communities in the face of unimaginable loss. In the end, while Caitlin Armstrong may have succeeded in ending Mo Wilson's life, she could not erase the positive impact that Wilson had on the world, or the memory of a young woman who lived her life with passion, purpose, and joy. The wheels of justice had turned, slowly but inexorably, bringing accountability for a crime that had shocked a community and a nation. But for those who knew and loved Mo Wilson, no amount of justice could fill the void left by her absence. A reminder that some losses are so profound that they can never truly be made whole. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we delve into a case that shook the Quad Cities community to its core. A story of innocence lost, a community united in search, and ultimately, the pursuit of justice for a little girl who should have been starting 5th grade. This is the story of Breasia Terrell. The summer of 2020 was unlike any other. The world was grappling with uncertainty. Families were staying closer to home, and in Davenport, Iowa, life moved at a slower, more careful pace. For 10-year-old Breasia Terrell, Summer meant time with friends, staying up late, and the simple joys that define childhood summers. Breasia was a vibrant child, full of life and curiosity. Her smile could light up a room, and those who knew her described her as a kind, gentle soul who loved spending time with her family. She lived with her mother, Iana Langford, who worked tirelessly to provide for her children and keep them safe in a world that sometimes felt overwhelming. On the evening of July 9th, 2020, Breasia was looking forward to spending time with her half-brother. Their mother had arranged for both children to stay the night at a family friend's place, a man named Henry Dinkins, who lived in a motorhome in the 700 block of Schmidt Road in Davenport. Dinkins was dating Andrea Culberson, and the children knew him through this family connection. As the sun set that Thursday evening, Breasia packed her things for what should have been a simple sleepover. She wore her favorite nightshirt, an oversized 4XL t-shirt that served as comfortable sleepwear. She was excited about the adventure of staying somewhere different, unaware that this night would change everything. The evening proceeded normally at first. The children settled in, watching television, talking, and enjoying the relaxed atmosphere of a summer night without school the next day. Andrea Culberson later testified that she went to sleep sometime before midnight, leaving the children in the living area of the modest motorhome. As the clock ticked past midnight, moving into the early hours of July 10th, 2020, something went terribly wrong. The details of those crucial hours would later become the subject of intense investigation, testimony, and heartbreak. The morning of July 10th dawned like any other summer day in Iowa. The sun rose over the Mississippi River, casting long shadows across Davenport's quiet neighborhoods. But in the motorhome on Schmidt Road, dawn brought a devastating discovery. Breasia was gone. According to the timeline later constructed by investigators, the sequence of events began to unfold in the early morning hours. Detective Evan Obert would later piece together a detailed chronology using video footage from businesses and residences, cell phone data, and witness testimony. Sometime before dawn, Henry Dinkins had left the motorhome. Surveillance footage would later show his movements throughout the morning, capturing glimpses of his vehicles in various locations around Davenport. What the cameras couldn't capture was what had happened to Breasia. When the adults in the motorhome fully awakened that morning, the absence of the 10-year-old immediately raised alarm. This wasn't a case of a child wandering off to explore or visit a neighbor. Breasia was a responsible child who wouldn't simply leave without telling someone where she was going. The initial response was what any parent or caregiver might do: searching the immediate area, calling her name, checking with neighbors. Perhaps she had gone for a walk. Perhaps she was visiting someone nearby. But as the minutes turned to hours, the knot of worry in everyone's stomach grew tighter. By noon on July 10th, Henry Dinkins arrived at the Davenport Police Department. The official search for Breasia Terrell was about to begin, though at this point nobody could have imagined the tragic journey that lay ahead. The Davenport Police Department responded swiftly to the report of a missing child. In cases involving children, time is always of the essence, and law enforcement knew that every minute could be crucial to bringing Breasia home safely. The initial search focused on areas where a 10-year-old might logically be found. Credit Island, a popular recreational area along the Mississippi River, became one of the first locations where officers concentrated their efforts. The island's parks, trails, and waterfront areas were systematically searched, with officers hoping to find signs that Breasia had simply wandered off and perhaps become lost or disoriented. As word of Breasia's disappearance spread throughout the community, something remarkable happened. Neighbors, friends, complete strangers began to mobilize. The search for Breasia Terrell was no longer just a police matter. It had become a community mission. Iana Langford, Breasia's mother, made emotional appeals to the public. Her pain was visible to everyone who saw her during those early days of the search. She spoke to local media outlets, asking anyone with information to come forward, pleading with her community to help find her daughter. On Saturday, July 11th, just one day after Breasia's disappearance was reported, Iana Langford organized a public search effort. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of volunteers showed up, ready to comb through every possible location where a young girl might be found. The searches were methodical and thorough. Volunteers spread out across Davenport and the surrounding areas, checking parks, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and anywhere else a child might seek shelter or might have been taken. They carried flyers with Breasia's photograph and distributed them throughout the Quad Cities region. Local businesses displayed missing person posters in their windows. Social media campaigns spread Breasia's picture far beyond Davenport, reaching hundreds of thousands of people across Iowa and Illinois. The hashtag movements and online sharing meant that Breasia's face was seen by people hundreds of miles away, all hoping they might spot her somewhere. The searches continued day after day. Volunteers would meet at designated locations each morning, receive assignments for areas to cover, and then spend hours walking through neighborhoods, calling Breasia's name, hoping for any sign of the missing girl. Among those who joined the search efforts was Christy Stansbury of Davenport, who was photographed on July 17th searching along U.S. Highway 30 in Lowmore, Iowa. Her determination exemplified the spirit of the hundreds of volunteers who refused to give up hope. Devil's Glen Park in Bettendorf became another focal point for the search efforts. Icia Langford was photographed hanging missing person posters throughout the park, her face etched with the worry and desperation that only a parent of a missing child can truly understand. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched toward months, the community's hope began to mix with a growing sense of dread. Where was Breasia Terrell? While the community searched, law enforcement was conducting their own intensive investigation. The Davenport Police Department, working with other agencies, began the methodical process of examining every aspect of Breasia's disappearance. Henry Dinkins quickly became a person of interest in the case. As the last person known to have seen Breasia alive, he was naturally a focal point of the investigation. But there were other factors that drew investigators' attention to him. Records revealed that Dinkins was a registered sex offender. This information, while not definitive proof of involvement in Breasia's disappearance, certainly elevated the level of concern and scrutiny surrounding his activities on July 10th and the days that followed. Investigators discovered that Dinkins had access to multiple vehicles, including a black 2012 Chevrolet Camaro and a red 207 Chevrolet Impala. This mobility gave him the ability to travel throughout the region, potentially taking Breasia far from Davenport if he had indeed abducted her. The timeline that Detective Evan Albert was constructing became increasingly detailed, using cell phone data, surveillance footage, and witness statements. Investigators began to piece together Dinkins's movements on July 10th. What they found raised more questions than answers. One particularly intriguing piece of evidence came from a witness who reported helping Dinkins pull his car from a ditch on the same day that Breasia went missing. This incident, which occurred somewhere in the rural areas surrounding Davenport, suggested that Dinkins may have traveled to remote locations that day. But despite the intensive investigation, despite the searches, despite the community's unwavering commitment to finding her, Breasia remained missing. The summer of 2020 passed without answers. Fall arrived, then winter, and still there was no trace of the 10-year-old girl who had vanished from a motorhome on Schmidt Road. The case remained active, but as the months passed, the fear that had been lurking in everyone's minds became harder to ignore. The search for a living Breasia was gradually becoming the search for answers about what had happened to her. March 22nd, 2021, started as an ordinary spring day in rural Clinton County, Iowa. The snow was melting, and the first signs of another Iowa spring were beginning to appear. But this day would bring an end to the uncertainty that had haunted the Quad Cities for more than 8 months. In a remote area near DeWitt, Iowa, human remains were discovered. The location was rural, isolated, the kind of place where someone might hide something they never wanted to be found. The remains were found near what locals knew as the Kuna dealership area, far from the busy streets of Davenport, where Breasia had last been seen. The discovery was made by someone who was not part of the official search efforts. Sometimes, in cases like these, it's an ordinary person going about their daily business who makes the breakthrough that law enforcement has been seeking for months. The remains were immediately secured by law enforcement, and the careful process of identification began. For Icia Langford and everyone who had spent months hoping and praying for Breasia's safe return, this discovery represented both an end to the uncertainty and the beginning of a different kind of pain. When the identification was confirmed, the worst fears of Breasia's family and community became reality. The remains were those of 10-year-old Breasia Terrell. The search for a missing child had become a homicide investigation. The medical examiner's investigation revealed that Breasia had been shot to death. This wasn't an accident, wasn't the result of exposure or misadventure. Someone had deliberately taken the life of this innocent child. The manner of death suggested that this was a premeditated act, carefully planned and executed. The discovery of Breasia's remains marked a turning point in the case. While her family and community grieved the loss of a life cut tragically short, law enforcement now had evidence that could potentially lead to justice. The investigation, which had been focused on finding Breasia alive, now shifted toward building a case against whoever was responsible for her death. All eyes turned to Henry Dinkins, the registered sex offender who had been the last person known to see Breasia alive. The circumstantial evidence that had made him a person of interest was now viewed through the lens of a homicide investigation. About a month after Breasia's remains were discovered, the break that investigators had been working toward finally came. In May 2021, Henry Dinkins was arrested and charged with first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder in connection with Breasia's death. The charges represented the culmination of months of investigation, thousands of hours of detective work, and the careful assembly of evidence that prosecutors believed would prove Dinkins' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. First-degree murder charges in Iowa carry the most serious penalties available under state law. The fact that prosecutors chose to file these charges indicated their confidence in the evidence they had gathered. First-degree kidnapping charges further suggested that they believed Dinkins had planned and executed not just Breasia's murder, but her abduction as well. For Iana, Langford and Breasia's family, the arrest brought a complex mix of emotions. There was relief that someone was being held accountable, but also the sobering reality that no arrest, no conviction, no punishment could bring back their beloved Breasia. The community that had rallied so powerfully during the search efforts now found themselves grappling with the confirmation that their worst fears had been realized. The little girl they had spent months looking for had been gone since the first day she disappeared. All those searches, all that hope, all those prayers had been for a child who was already beyond saving. But even with Dinkins' arrest, many questions remained unanswered. What exactly had happened in those early morning hours of July 10th, 2020? What had motivated this terrible crime? And how could the community make sense of such a senseless loss? As the case moved through the legal system, these questions would gradually be addressed. But the answers, when they finally came, would prove to be even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The prosecution's case against Henry Dinkins required meticulous preparation. Unlike cases where there are eyewitnesses to the crime or overwhelming physical evidence, this case would depend largely on circumstantial evidence, expert testimony, and the careful reconstruction of events. Prosecutors had to address several challenging aspects of the case. The most significant challenge was that Breasia's body had been exposed to the elements for more than 8 months before being discovered. This meant that much of the physical evidence that might have been available in cases where bodies are found quickly was no longer present. However, investigators had not been idle during those 8 months. They had collected extensive surveillance footage from businesses and residences throughout Davenport. Tracking Dinkins' movements on July 10th, they had analyzed cell phone data that could place him in specific locations at specific times. They had interviewed dozens of witnesses and followed up on hundreds of tips from the community. One of the most challenging aspects of building the case was establishing a clear timeline of events. The prosecution needed to show not just that Dinkins had the opportunity to commit the crime, but that his actions on July 10th were consistent with someone who had abducted and murdered a child. The timeline that Detective Obert had constructed became crucial evidence. It showed Dinkins' movements from the early morning hours when Breasia disappeared through his arrival at the police station at noon. The timeline revealed gaps in his whereabouts that could account for the time needed to commit the crime and dispose of Breasia's body. The prosecution also had to address the question of motive. Why would Dinkins, who had a relationship with the family through Andrea Culberson, target Breasia? This question would become more complex as additional evidence emerged. But prosecutors believed they could establish that Dinkins' status as a registered sex offender was relevant to understanding his actions. The defense, meanwhile, was preparing their own case. Defense attorneys in cases like this faced the challenging task of creating reasonable doubt about their client's guilt while being sensitive to the community's grief and outrage over the death of a child. As the case prepared to go to trial, both sides knew that the stakes could not be higher. For the prosecution, this was about obtaining justice for Breasia and her family. For the defense, it was about ensuring that their client received a fair trial despite the emotionally charged nature of the case. The trial of Henry Dinkins began in August 2023, more than 3 years after Breasia's disappearance. The Scott County Courthouse became the focal point for a community that had been waiting years for answers. The prosecution's opening statement painted a picture of a man who had betrayed the trust placed in him by a family who allowed their children to stay in his care. They argued that Dinkins had planned and executed Breasia's murder, then spent months trying to avoid accountability for his actions. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence presented by the prosecution was the detailed timeline that Detective Obert had constructed. This timeline, based on surveillance footage, cell phone data, and witness testimony, attempted to account for every minute of July 10, 2020, from midnight to noon. The timeline showed that Andrea Culberson had gone to sleep before midnight on July 9th. It tracked various movements and activities throughout the early morning hours, culminating with Dinkins' arrival at the police station at noon on July 10th to report Breasia's disappearance. But it was the gaps in the timeline that proved most significant. There were periods during the early morning hours where Dinkins' whereabouts could not be definitively established. The prosecution argued that these gaps provided the window of opportunity for him to abduct and murder Breasia. The prosecution also presented evidence about the witness who had helped Dinkins pull his car from a ditch on July 10th. They wanted the jury to consider whether this incident was connected to Dinkins' disposal of Breasia's body. Why had he been driving in remote rural areas on the day Breasia disappeared? What had he been doing that caused his car to become stuck? Throughout the early days of the trial, the courtroom was filled with members of the community who had participated in the searches for Breasia, who had prayed for her safe return, and who now sought to see justice done in her name. As the trial progressed, the prosecution called a series of witnesses to testify about various aspects of the case. But no testimony was more shocking or more heartbreaking than that of an unexpected witness, Dinkins' own son. The boy, who had been 8 years old when Breasia had disappeared, took the stand to testify about what he claimed to have witnessed on that terrible night. For the first time since the investigation began, he made an assertion that stunned everyone in the courtroom. The child testified that he had seen his father shoot Breasia Terrell. This testimony represented a dramatic development in the case. Previously, the prosecution had been building their case largely on circumstantial evidence and the careful reconstruction of events. Now, they'd potentially had an eyewitness to the crime, though an eyewitness whose testimony came with significant complications. The boy's testimony raised many questions. Why had he not mentioned this earlier in the investigation? What were the circumstances that led him to see this alleged shooting? How reliable could the testimony of a child be, particularly when that child was testifying against his own father? The defense attorneys faced a difficult situation. Cross-examining a child witness requires extreme care, particularly in a case involving the murder of another child. They had to challenge the reliability and consistency of the testimony without appearing to attack a young victim of this tragic situation. The testimony also raised questions about what else the boy might have witnessed that night. If he had indeed seen the shooting, what other details could he provide about the events leading up to Breasia's death? For the jury, this testimony represented perhaps the most crucial evidence they would hear. Direct eyewitness testimony to a murder is rare in any criminal case. But eyewitness testimony from a child witness carries additional complexities that jurors must carefully consider. The boy's testimony suggested that he had also seen his father cleaning a machete afterward, though this detail raised additional questions about the circumstances and timing of these alleged observations. The defense team faced an enormous challenge in responding to the child witness's testimony. They had to address this evidence, while also presenting their own theory of what had happened to Breasia Terrell. Defense attorneys argued that the child's testimony was unreliable and inconsistent. They pointed out that he had not mentioned seeing the shooting during earlier interviews with investigators. They questioned whether a traumatic event could cause a child's memory to be confused or whether outside influences might have affected his recollection of events. The defense also challenged other aspects of the prosecution's case. They argued that the physical evidence did not support the conclusion that Dinkins had murdered Breasia. They pointed out that despite extensive searches of Dinkins' motorhome and vehicles, investigators had not found blood, DNA, hair, or other physical evidence that would definitively link him to the crime. This absence of physical evidence was indeed a significant aspect of the case. In many murder cases, investigators are able to find traces of the victim in the defendant's home, vehicles, or clothing. The lack of such evidence in this case created questions about where and how the crime had been committed. The defense also raised questions about the investigation itself. They argued that law enforcement had focused too quickly on Dinkins as a suspect and had not adequately explored other possibilities for what might have happened to Breasia. However, the defense faced the significant challenge of providing an alternative explanation for Breasia's disappearance and death. If Dinkins had not killed her, then who had? And how could they account for the various pieces of circumstantial evidence that pointed to his involvement? The defense team also had to address Dinkins' status as a registered sex offender. While this status did not prove that he had committed murder, it certainly created additional suspicion and made him a more likely suspect in the eyes of both investigators and jurors. After hearing all the evidence, witness testimony, and closing arguments from both sides, the jury began their deliberations. They had to consider whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Henry Dinkins was guilty of kidnapping and murdering Breasia Terrell. The jury's task was not easy. They had to weigh the testimony of a child witness against questions about its reliability. They had to consider whether the circumstantial evidence was sufficient to prove guilt. They had to evaluate the prosecution's timeline and determine whether the gaps in Dinkins' whereabouts were significant enough to support a murder conviction. They also had to consider the defense's arguments about the lack of physical evidence and questions about the investigation. In a case where so much depended on inference and reconstruction of events, the jury had to be convinced that there was no reasonable doubt about Dinkins' guilt. On September 19, 2023, Judge Henry Latham announced the jury's verdict. Henry Dinkins was found guilty of both first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder in the death of Breasia Terrell. As Judge Latham read the verdict, he stated that it was beyond a reasonable doubt that the remains found near the Kunow dealership were those of Breasia, and that the evidence supported the conclusion that Dinkins was responsible for her death. The verdict brought a sense of legal closure to a case that had haunted the Quad Cities community for more than 3 years. For Gia Langford and Breasia's family, the guilty verdict meant that someone was being held accountable for their devastating loss. The conviction represented the culmination of years of investigation, the dedication of law enforcement officers who never gave up on finding answers, and the persistence of a community that refused to forget Breasia Terrell. The case of Breasia Terrell forces us to confront some of the darkest aspects of human nature, but it also reveals the best of what communities can be when they come together in crisis. The response to Breasia's disappearance demonstrated something remarkable about the human spirit. Hundreds of strangers gave up their weekends, their evenings, their free time to search for a child they had never met. They did this not because they expected anything in return, but because they recognized that when a child goes missing, it becomes everyone's responsibility to help bring them home. Local businesses displayed missing person posters without being asked. Social media users shared Breasia's photograph thousands of times, expanding the search far beyond Iowa's borders. Volunteers organized search parties, distributed flyers, and kept Breasia's case in the public consciousness during the months when she remained missing. This community response didn't bring Breasia home alive, but it ensured that she was not forgotten, that her case remained a priority for law enforcement, and that when her remains were finally found, there was a community ready to support her family through their grief. The case also highlights the complexity of protecting children in our communities. Henry Dinkins was a registered sex offender, known to authorities, yet he was still in a position where families trusted him with the care of their children. This raises difficult questions about how communities can balance the need for rehabilitation and second chances with the imperative to protect the most vulnerable. For law enforcement, the Breasia Terrell case represents both the challenges and the importance of thorough investigation in cases involving missing children. The timeline reconstruction, the analysis of surveillance footage, the careful preservation and analysis of evidence, all of these elements were crucial to eventually obtaining justice for Breasia. The case also demonstrates the difficulties that prosecutors face when building cases that depend largely on circumstantial evidence. Without eyewitnesses, without overwhelming physical evidence, they had to construct their case piece by piece, inference by inference, until they could present a picture that convinced a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Breasia Terrell was 10 years old when her life was cut short. She should have been starting 5th grade in the fall of 2020. She should have experienced her 11th birthday, her 12th, and all the birthdays that followed. She should have had the chance to grow up, to discover her talents and passions, to make her mark on the world. Instead, she became the victim of a terrible crime that shocked her community and highlighted the vulnerability that all children face in a world where not all adults can be trusted to protect them. But Breasia's legacy extends beyond the tragedy of her death. Her case brought together a community in ways that demonstrated the power of collective action and shared concern. It showed that when faced with the worst that humans can do, Other humans will respond with determination, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The hundreds of people who searched for Breasia, the investigators who worked tirelessly to solve her case, the prosecutors who fought for justice on her behalf, all of them were motivated by the simple conviction that every child deserves protection, that every child's life has value, and that those who harm children must be held accountable. Ashia Langford lost her daughter in the most terrible way imaginable. No verdict, no sentence, no form of justice can undo that loss or fill the void that Breasia's death created in her family's life. But the conviction of Henry Dinkins ensures that he will be held accountable for taking away a future that should have been filled with endless possibilities. As we close this story, we remember Breasia not just as the victim of a crime, but as a child who was loved, who brought joy to those who knew her, and who became the catalyst for a community to come together in the face of tragedy. The case of Breasia Terrell reminds us that justice, while it cannot restore what was lost, serves as society's way of affirming that some actions are unacceptable, that some losses demand accountability, and that even in our darkest moments, we will not give up on doing what is right. In remembering Breasia, we honor not just her life, but the principle that every child deserves protection, every family deserves justice, and every community has the responsibility to care for its most vulnerable members. This is the story of Breasia Terrell, a life cut short, a community united, and justice finally served. May she rest in peace, and may her story serve as a reminder of the preciousness of every child's life, and the importance of the vigilance we must all maintain to protect them. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet suburbs of Jacksonville, Florida, December 19, 2018 began like any other school day. The halls of Terry Parker High School buzzed with the familiar sounds of teenage life. Lockers slamming, conversations echoing, the rustle of backpacks and papers. For most students, this was just another Wednesday before the Christmas holidays, a day to endure before winter break began. But for 16-year-old Iana Sawyer, this day would mark the end of everything she had ever known, everything she had ever hoped to become. Iana Michelle Sawyer was not your typical teenager struggling through high school. She was a straight-A student, the kind of young woman teachers praised and parents held up as an example. Her academic achievements spoke of a bright future ahead, of dreams waiting to be realized and potential that seemed limitless. Those who knew Iana described her as destined for greatness. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that suggested she understood the value of education, the importance of working hard, and the possibilities that lay ahead of her. Her teachers saw in her the kind of student who would graduate with honors, attend college, and make something meaningful of her life. But behind this facade of academic success, Iana was carrying a secret that would ultimately cost her everything. She was 5 months pregnant, and the identity of the father would soon reveal a betrayal so profound that it would shake her family to its very core. The surveillance cameras at Terry Parker High School captured the final moments of Iana's life with mechanical precision. The timestamp read December 19, 2018, and the footage showed a young woman who appeared to be leaving school with purpose. She carried 2 large bags, their contents a mystery that investigators would later try to piece together. This was during lunch period, an unusual time for any student to leave campus entirely. But Iana wasn't just skipping the rest of her classes. She believed she was walking toward a new life, toward freedom from the complicated situation she found herself in. According to what investigators would later determine, Iana had been told that she and the father of her child were going to run away together. She had been convinced that this was their chance to start fresh somewhere new, to build a life away from the judgment and complications that might arise if their relationship became public. She drove her own car that day, following directions that would take her to Ace Pick-A-Part, a sprawling junkyard on the outskirts of Jacksonville. It was the kind of place where old cars went to die, where twisted metal and broken dreams lay scattered across acres of forgotten machinery. It was also the perfect place for someone to disappear. When Iana failed to return home that afternoon, Her family's concern grew with each passing hour. This wasn't like her. Despite whatever personal struggles she might have been facing, Iana was responsible, reliable. She didn't just vanish without explanation. Her mother, Iana Sawyer, contacted the school first, then friends, then anyone who might have seen or heard from her daughter. Each phone call brought the same disappointing response. No one had seen Iana since she left school that day. As evening turned to night and night stretched toward dawn, the family's worry transformed into panic. They contacted the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to report Iana missing. What they couldn't have imagined was that the person responsible for her disappearance was someone they trusted completely. Someone who had been part of their family gatherings, their celebrations, their lives. Detective work in missing person cases often begins with the basics. Last known location, recent contacts, any changes in behavior or circumstances. In Gianna's case, investigators quickly learned about her pregnancy, a fact that added urgency to their search efforts. The surveillance footage from Terry Parker High School provided a timeline and showed Iana's apparent willingness to leave school voluntarily. She didn't appear to be under duress in the video. Instead, she seemed to be following a plan. Investigators began interviewing family members, friends, and anyone else who had regular contact with Iana. They needed to understand her state of mind, her relationships, and any potential threats or concerns in her life. During this process, they learned something that would fundamentally change the direction of their investigation. Family members revealed that Iana had been staying along with other relatives at the home of her uncle, Jonathan Quayles, for weeks at a time. Quayles was 31 years old, married, with a young daughter of his own. He was someone the family trusted, someone who had opened his home to relatives who needed a place to stay. On the surface, he appeared to be nothing more than a helpful family member. But as investigators dug deeper, a more disturbing picture began to emerge. The breakthrough in the case came when DNA testing revealed the identity of the father of Iana's unborn child. The results were shocking, devastating, and provided investigators with a clear motive for her disappearance. Jonathan Quayles, Iana's own uncle, the man her family had trusted, the person who had provided shelter and support, was the father of her baby. This revelation transformed what had been a missing person case into something far more sinister. Investigators now understood that Iana's disappearance wasn't random, wasn't the result of a stranger abduction or a teenage runaway situation. This was something much darker, something that spoke to betrayal, abuse, and ultimately murder. The implications were staggering. Quayles had been in a position of trust and authority over Iana. He had exploited that relationship in the most heinous way possible, impregnating a child who was under his care and protection. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged about Jonathan Quayles and his relationship with the young women in his extended family. While Iana's case was making headlines, investigators discovered he had also been charged with sexual battery against another relative, a 14-year-old girl who had been at his home babysitting his daughter. This pattern of behavior painted a picture of a predator who had been operating within his own family circle, using his position of trust to exploit vulnerable young women. The family members who had seen him as helpful and generous began to understand they had been harboring someone who posed a serious threat to the children in their lives. Quayles had carefully constructed his deception, presenting himself as the concerned uncle while simultaneously manipulating and abusing the very people he claimed to be helping. The psychological impact on the family was devastating. Not only were they dealing with Iana's disappearance, but they were also grappling with the realization that someone they trusted had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. The investigation led detectives to Ace Pickapart, the junkyard where surveillance footage and cell phone data indicated Iana had been lured on that December day. This sprawling facility, filled with thousands of abandoned and destroyed vehicles, represented both a crime scene and a potential burial ground. According to the evidence that would later be presented at trial, this was where Jonathan Quayles shot and killed his 16-year-old niece and her unborn child. The isolated location, surrounded by twisted metal and industrial debris, provided the perfect cover for a cold-blooded execution. The motive, prosecutors would argue, was simple yet horrifying. Quayles couldn't allow his secret to become public. He couldn't risk the exposure that would come if people learned he had impregnated his teenage niece. His reputation, his marriage, his freedom, all of it depended on keeping this secret buried forever. So he convinced Iana that they were going to run away together, that they would start a new life somewhere else. She believed him because she trusted him, because he was family, because she couldn't imagine that someone who claimed to love her could be capable of such ultimate betrayal. Following Iana's murder, investigators believe Quayles disposed of her body in a dumpster, which was then transported to the Otis Road landfill. This presented investigators with an almost impossible task, searching through thousands of tons of refuse in hopes of finding physical evidence of the crime. The search effort was massive and heartbreaking. Investigators and volunteers sifted through more than 5,000 tons of trash, knowing that somewhere in that mountain of waste lay the remains of a young woman who had been murdered by someone she trusted. Despite their exhaustive efforts, Iana's body was never recovered. The inability to locate Iana's remains added another layer of trauma for her family. Not only had they lost their daughter and sister, but they were denied the closure that comes with being able to lay their loved one to rest. She remained missing, lost somewhere in the depths of a landfill, her final resting place unknown. Despite the lack of physical remains, prosecutors were determined to build a solid case against Jonathan Quayles. They had DNA evidence proving he was the father of Iana's unborn child. They had surveillance footage and cell phone data placing both victim and suspect in the same location at the crucial time. They had established motive, means, and opportunity. But perhaps most importantly, they had obtained recordings of Quayles making incriminating statements while he was in jail awaiting trial. Using informants and recording devices, investigators captured conversations in which Quayles revealed details about the crime that only the killer would know. These recordings would prove crucial during the trial phase of the case. While Quayles maintained his innocence publicly, the private conversations painted a very different picture. One of a man who knew exactly what had happened to Iana and had played a direct role in her death. Throughout the investigation and eventual trial, Iana's family faced an almost unbearable situation. Not only were they mourning the loss of a beloved daughter and sister, but they were also grappling with the realization that the killer was one of their own. The betrayal cut deep on multiple levels. Quayles hadn't just murdered Iana. He had violated the trust of an entire family. He had taken advantage of their generosity, their willingness to help relatives in need, and turned it into an opportunity for exploitation and ultimately murder. Family members had to testify against someone they had once considered part of their inner circle. They had to recount memories and interactions with Quayles, knowing now that his intentions had been predatory from the beginning. The psychological toll was immense. Iana Sawyer, Iana's mother, became the face of the family's quest for justice. She spoke at press conferences and court hearings, always maintaining hope that her daughter's killer would be held accountable, even though Iana's body might never be found. When Jonathan Quayles finally went to trial in September 2023, nearly 5 years after Iana's disappearance, the courtroom was packed with family members, supporters, and members of the media who had followed this tragic case from the beginning. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. They presented the DNA evidence showing Quayles was the father of Iana's unborn child. They showed surveillance footage of Iana leaving school on the day she disappeared. They presented cell phone data placing both victim and suspect in the same location. But perhaps most damaging were the recordings made while Quayles was in jail. In these conversations, he revealed details about the crime that demonstrated intimate knowledge of what had happened to Iana. The jury heard his own voice describing elements of the murder that only the killer could know. The defense attempted to raise questions about the evidence and suggest alternative theories, but the case against Quayles was overwhelming. The combination of physical evidence, circumstantial evidence, and his own recorded statements created a picture that was impossible to ignore. After approximately 1 hour of deliberations, the jury returned with their verdict. Jonathan Quayles was found guilty on all counts. First-degree murder in the death of Iana Sawyer, first-degree murder in the death of her unborn child, and sexual battery. The speed of the deliberation spoke to the strength of the evidence and the clarity of the case. 12 jurors had looked at all the evidence, heard all the testimony, and reached the same conclusion with remarkable efficiency. For Iana's family, the verdict represented a measure of justice, though it could never bring back the young woman they had lost. They had waited nearly 5 years for this moment, and while the guilty verdict provided some sense of closure, the absence of Iana's physical remains meant their grief remained complicated by unanswered questions. During the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury that had convicted Quayles had to decide whether he should face the death penalty or life in prison without parole. Florida law allowed for capital punishment in cases involving the murder of children, and prosecutors had argued that the circumstances of this case warranted the ultimate penalty. The jury heard testimony about Iana's life, her dreams, her potential, and the devastating impact her loss had on her family. They learned about the young woman she had been, and the future that had been stolen from her. They also heard testimony about the unborn child who had also been killed, a life that never had the chance to begin, dreams that would never be realized, milestones that would never be reached. After careful consideration, the jury chose to sentence Jonathan Queals to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While he had escaped the death penalty, he would never again walk free. He would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, paying for the crimes he had committed against his own family. The murder of Iana Sawyer sent shockwaves through Jacksonville and beyond, not just because of the tragic loss of a promising young life, but because of the nature of the betrayal involved. This wasn't a case of a stranger abduction or a random act of violence. This was a family member exploiting trust in the most horrific way possible. The case highlighted the vulnerability of children within their own families, the ways predators can hide in plain sight, and the devastating consequences when trust is betrayed. It served as a reminder that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from those closest to us. For other families, Iana's story became a cautionary tale about the importance of listening to children, watching for warning signs, and never assuming that family relationships automatically guarantee safety. The case prompted discussions about how to protect vulnerable young people, and how to recognize predatory behavior before it escalates to tragedy. In the aftermath of her death and her uncle's conviction, Iana Sawyer's family has worked to ensure that she is remembered, not just as a victim, but as the remarkable young woman she was. They speak of her academic achievements, her dreams for the future, and the joy she brought to their lives. She was, by all accounts, destined for greatness. At just 16, she had already demonstrated the kind of academic excellence and personal character that suggested a bright future ahead. She had plans, dreams, goals, all of which were cut short by someone who was supposed to protect her. The family has established ways to honor her memory and keep her story alive, not just as a tragedy, but as a celebration of a life that, while brief, had meaning and value. They want people to remember Iana for who she was, not just for what happened to her. Even after Jonathan Queals' conviction, the search for Iana's remains continues in some form. Her family holds on to hope that someday, somehow they might be able to bring her home and give her the burial she deserves. The vast expanse of the Otis Road landfill, where her body is believed to be buried, represents both the final resting place of a young woman and a testament to the thoroughness of the investigation that sought to find her. Though thousands of tons of refuse were searched without success, the effort demonstrated the commitment of law enforcement and the community to finding answers and bringing closure to her family. Technology continues to advance, and there remains a possibility that future developments might assist in locating Iana's remains. For now, her family must find peace in knowing that her killer has been brought to justice, even as they continue to hope for the day they can finally lay her to rest. The conviction of Jonathan Queals marked the end of one chapter in this tragic story, but it was not the end of the healing process for Iana's family. The wounds inflicted by her murder and the betrayal by someone they trusted run deep, and recovery will likely be a lifelong process. The family has expressed gratitude for the work of law enforcement, the prosecutors who handled the case, and the community members who supported them throughout the long journey to justice. They have found strength in each other and in the knowledge that Iana's story has been told. Her killer has been held accountable, and her memory continues to live on. While nothing can bring Iana back or undo the horror of what happened to her, the conviction provides a measure of justice and ensures that the person responsible for her death will never be able to harm another young person. The murder of Iana Sawyer serves as a stark reminder of several important truths about family violence and predatory behavior. It shows us that predators often hide in plain sight, using positions of trust and authority to exploit vulnerable victims. It demonstrates the devastating impact that family violence can have, not just on immediate victims, but on entire family systems. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that children and teenagers need advocates, protectors, and safe adults who will listen to them and take their concerns seriously. The grooming and manipulation that led to Iana's pregnancy likely occurred over time, and there might have been opportunities for intervention if someone had recognized the warning signs. As we remember Iana Sawyer, We honor not just her memory, but also our collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable members of our communities. Her story should serve as a call to action for all of us to be more vigilant, more aware, and more willing to speak up when something doesn't seem right. On that December morning in 2018, when Iana Sawyer walked out of Terry Parker High School for the final time, she believed she was walking toward a new beginning. She trusted someone who had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. And that trust cost her everything. But her story doesn't end with her death. It continues through the dedication of the investigators who worked tirelessly to build a case without physical remains, through the prosecutors who fought for justice in her name, through the family members who refused to let her memory fade, and through every person who has heard her story and committed to protecting the vulnerable people in their own lives. Iana Michelle Sawyer was 16 years old when she died, pregnant with a child she would never hold, full of dreams she would never realize. She was a straight-A student destined for greatness. And while her life was cut tragically short, her impact continues to be felt by all who knew her story. She deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved to grow up, to graduate, to pursue her dreams, to become the remarkable woman she was clearly destined to be. While we cannot give her back her future, we can ensure that her memory serves as a reminder of the preciousness of every life, and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In the quiet moments when we remember Iana Sawyer, we remember not just a victim, but a young woman whose life had value, whose dreams mattered, and whose story continues to resonate with all of us who believe that justice, while sometimes delayed, must ultimately prevail. The case of Iana Sawyer reminds us that true crime stories are not just about the crimes themselves, but about the lives that were lost, the families that were shattered, and the communities that were forever changed. Her story is one of tragedy, yes, but also of resilience, justice, and the enduring power of love and memory to transcend even the darkest acts of betrayal. Rest in peace, Iana Michelle Sawyer, forever 16, never forgotten. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we journey to the quiet coastal town of Neptune City, New Jersey, where the salty air carries stories of both beauty and betrayal. This is the story of Sarah Stern, a 19-year-old with bright eyes and bigger dreams, whose trust in childhood friends would lead to an unthinkable tragedy. Sarah Stern was the kind of person who left an impression wherever she went. Born and raised in Neptune City, New Jersey, she embodied the spirit of the Jersey Shore in all the best ways. With her infectious laugh and genuine warmth, Sarah had a way of making everyone around her feel like they mattered. She wasn't the type to chase drama or get caught up in petty high school politics. Instead, she focused on her dreams and her future. At 19, Sarah was a student in Neptune High School, who had recently graduated and was looking forward to starting the next chapter of her life. She lived in a modest home with her father, Michael Stern, who had raised her as a single parent after her mother's death from cancer when Sarah was just a child. The loss had brought father and daughter closer together, creating a bond that was unbreakable, or so it seemed. Sarah worked part-time to help support herself and save money for college. She was practical, responsible, and had learned the value of hard work from watching her father navigate life as a single parent. But despite the challenges her family had faced, Sarah maintained an optimistic outlook on life. She believed in people, trusted easily, and saw the good in everyone, including those who would ultimately betray that trust. The Stern family had deep roots in their community. Sarah's grandmother lived nearby, and the extended family network provided stability and support. Sarah was particularly close to her grandmother, often borrowing her old Oldsmobile when she needed transportation. It was a simple arrangement that spoke to the trust and love within the family unit. In the world of Neptune City, everyone knew everyone. It was the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other, where high school relationships often lasted well beyond graduation, and where secrets were hard to keep. Sarah moved through this world with confidence, never imagining that someone she had known since childhood would see her not as a friend, but as an opportunity. Among Sarah's circle of friends were two young men who had known her since their school days, Liam McKenzie and Preston Taylor. These weren't strangers who had drifted into Sarah's life. They were part of her history, woven into the fabric of her teenage years and early adulthood. Liam McCadesney was 21 years old, a year older than Sarah, and someone who had always been on the periphery of her social circle. He was known as somewhat of a dreamer, always talking about big plans and get-rich-quick schemes that never seemed to materialize. Those who knew him described someone who was charming when he wanted to be, but who also had a darker side that emerged when things didn't go his way. McCadesney had a habit of inflating his own importance and exaggerating his circumstances. He would tell people about money he didn't have, opportunities that existed only in his imagination, and plans that were more fantasy than reality. But in a small town like Neptune City, these quirks were often overlooked or dismissed as harmless boasting. Preston Taylor, on the other hand, had a more direct connection to Sarah. He had been her prom date, a memory that should have remained a sweet milestone in both their lives. Taylor was 19, the same age as Sarah, and had grown up alongside her in the tight-knit community. He was generally seen as a follower rather than a leader, someone who went along with plans rather than making them. The relationship between Taylor and Sarah had evolved from romantic interest to friendship over the years. There was a comfort between them, built on shared history and mutual respect. Sarah trusted Taylor. After all, he was the boy she had chosen to accompany her to one of the most important nights of her high school career. McCadesney and Taylor were also friends with each other, having even been roommates at one point. Their friendship was built on a foundation of shared interests, and unfortunately shared moral flexibility that would prove deadly. In retrospect, those who knew them would describe warning signs, moments of selfishness, instances of questionable judgment, and a gradual shift towards seeing others as means to their own ends rather than as valued friends. But in December 2016, these red flags weren't yet visible to Sarah. To her, these young men were simply part of her world, familiar faces in a community where everyone was connected by invisible threads of shared experience and assumed loyalty. What Sarah didn't know was that Liam McCadesney had developed a dangerous obsession, not with her but with her money. In his mind, Sarah Stern had become the solution to his financial problems, the key to the lifestyle he felt he deserved, but had been unable to achieve through legitimate means. McCadesney had somehow gotten it into his head that Sarah had access to significant amounts of cash. He believed incorrectly that she had inherited around $100,000 and was keeping it in her home. This belief, based more on wishful thinking than reality, became a consuming fixation for him. He began to see Sarah not as a friend to be treasured, but as a target to be exploited. The twisted logic of McCadesney's thinking revealed itself in conversations he had with others. He spoke about Sarah's supposed wealth with a mixture of envy and entitlement, as if her money was somehow rightfully his. He began to construct elaborate fantasies about how he could access these funds, scenarios that grew increasingly dark as his financial desperation deepened. What makes this obsession particularly chilling is how calculated it was. McCadesney wasn't acting on sudden impulse or temporary desperation. He was planning, scheming, and gradually working himself up to a point where he could justify taking whatever he wanted from someone who trusted him. The fact that Sarah considered him a friend made his intentions all the more predatory. McCadesney's view of the situation was remarkably self-centered. In his mind, Sarah's money was wasted on her. She wasn't using it properly, wasn't maximizing its potential. He, on the other hand, could put it to better use. This warped thinking allowed him to rationalize what he was planning to do, to convince himself that he wasn't just taking something, but somehow improving the situation. Preston Taylor became swept up in McCadesney's schemes, though initially as a reluctant participant. McCadesney was persuasive, painting pictures of easy money and shared prosperity. He made it sound simple, straightforward, almost victimless. Of course, nothing about what they were planning was any of those things. As December 2016 progressed, McCadesney's plans became more concrete. He wasn't just fantasizing anymore. He was preparing to act. And tragically, Sarah Stern had no idea that someone she trusted was seeing her as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. December 2nd, 2016 started like any other Friday night for Sarah Stern. She had been spending time with friends, making the kinds of casual plans that 19-year-olds make without thinking twice about them. She was using her grandmother's old Oldsmobile that evening, a car that had become familiar to everyone in their social circle. What Sarah didn't know was that this ordinary Friday would be her last night alive, and that the person who would take her life was someone she had absolutely no reason to fear. Liam McCadesney arrived at Sarah's home that evening with murder already on his mind. He had crossed the line from fantasy to intention, from planning to action. When he walked through her door, he wasn't visiting a friend. He was executing a plan that he had been developing for weeks, if not months. According to the evidence that would later emerge in court, McKenzie's attack on Sarah was both sudden and prolonged. He strangled her in her own home, a place where she should have been completely safe. The prosecution would later argue that McKenzie lifted Sarah off the ground during the attack, using such force that her feet left the floor. Perhaps most chilling of all, McKenzie didn't just kill Sarah and leave. Instead, he watched her die. According to his own later confession, he stood there for 30 minutes watching the clock as Sarah's life ebbed away. This detail speaks to a level of coldness and calculation that goes beyond even premeditated murder. It suggests someone who was not just willing to kill, but who wanted to witness the complete process of death. The money that had driven McKenzie to murder. He found about $8,000 in Sarah's home, a significant sum, but nowhere near the $100,000 he had convinced himself was there. In his greed and desperation, he had taken a life for a fraction of what he expected to gain. The realization that his expectations were so far off reality didn't seem to cause him any regret, only frustration that the payoff wasn't larger. After murdering Sarah, McKenzie called Preston Taylor. This wasn't a panicked call from someone who had acted in the heat of the moment. It was a calculated request for help from someone who had already planned the next steps. McKenzie needed Taylor's assistance to dispose of Sarah's body and create the illusion that she had taken her own life. Preston Taylor's decision to help McKenzie dispose of Sarah's body marked his transformation from potential witness to active accomplice. When Taylor arrived at Sarah's home and saw what McKenzie had done, he had a choice to make. He could have called the police, sought help, or simply walked away. Instead, he chose to become complicit in one of the most callous cover-ups in New Jersey criminal history. Together, the two young men loaded Sarah's body into a vehicle and drove to the Route 35 bridge, which spans the Shark River between Neptune and Belmar. This bridge, which should have been just another piece of infrastructure in their familiar landscape, became the site where they would attempt to erase Sarah from existence entirely. The plan was as cruel as it was calculated. They threw Sarah's body off the bridge into the Shark River below, treating her remains with a level of disrespect that defies comprehension. Then, in an attempt to stage her death as a suicide, they positioned her grandmother's Oldsmobile on the bridge with the keys inside, making it appear as though Sarah had taken her own life by jumping into the water. This staging reveals the depth of their callousness. Not only had they murdered Sarah, but they were now prepared to let her family and friends believe that she had chosen to end her own life. They were willing to let the people who loved Sarah live with the devastating belief that she had been in such despair that death seemed like her only option. The cover-up required them to lie repeatedly to investigators, to Sarah's family, and to their own friends. They had to pretend to be concerned about Sarah's disappearance while knowing exactly what had happened to her. They had to comfort her grieving father while being responsible for his grief. They had to participate in search efforts while knowing that the search was futile. Preston Taylor, in particular, had to face Sarah's father and other family members, knowing that he had helped dispose of her body. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain such a deception speaks to a level of emotional detachment that is difficult to comprehend. The staged suicide scene was discovered on December 3rd, just one day after Sarah's murder. Her abandoned car, positioned on the bridge with the keys inside, immediately raised concerns among family and friends who knew that suicide was completely out of character for Sarah. She wasn't someone who struggled with depression or who had ever expressed suicidal thoughts. The scenario that McKenzie and Taylor had created simply didn't match the Sarah Stern that people knew and loved. When Sarah's car was found on the Route 35 bridge on December 3, 2016, the Neptune City Police Department immediately launched an investigation into her disappearance. Initially, they had to consider the possibility that Sarah had indeed taken her own life. But interviews with family and friends quickly revealed that this scenario was highly unlikely. Sarah's father, Michael Stern, was adamant that his daughter would never have committed suicide. He knew her better than anyone, and he insisted that she had been looking forward to the future, not running from it. Friends echoed this sentiment, describing Sarah as someone who was excited about her plans and optimistic about what lay ahead. The investigation team, led by experienced detectives who understood the dynamics of small-town relationships, began to examine Sarah's social circle. They interviewed friends, family members, and acquaintances, trying to piece together Sarah's final days and identify anyone who might have had reason to harm her. What they discovered was a young woman who was well-liked and had no obvious enemies. Sarah wasn't involved in any dramatic relationships, wasn't mixed up with drugs or other illegal activities, and hadn't been receiving threats or experiencing harassment. In many ways, she was an ideal victim from a criminal's perspective, trusting, accessible, and unlikely to suspect danger from someone she knew. The investigators were particularly interested in the timing of Sarah's disappearance. She had been seen alive on the evening of December 2nd, but her car was found abandoned early on December 3rd. This narrow window suggested that whatever had happened to Sarah had occurred quickly, probably in her own home or somewhere else she felt safe. As the investigation progressed, detectives began to focus on the people who had been closest to Sarah. This wasn't because they suspected her family or friends of wrongdoing, but because they understood that most violent crimes against young women are committed by people they know and trust. Liam McKenzie and Preston Taylor were both interviewed during this initial phase of the investigation. Both expressed concern about Sarah's disappearance and claimed to have no knowledge of what might have happened to her. To the untrained observer, their responses might have seemed genuine. They said the right things, expressed appropriate emotions, and offered to help in any way they could. But experienced investigators noticed subtle inconsistencies in their stories. Small details didn't quite match up between interviews, and both young men seemed to have carefully prepared answers to certain questions. These red flags weren't enough to make arrests, but they were enough to keep McKenzie and Taylor on the investigators' radar. The breakthrough in Sarah's case came from an unexpected source. Anthony Curry, an amateur filmmaker who was also a good friend of Liam McKenzie. In January 2017, about a month after Sarah's murder, Curry approached authorities with information that would completely change the direction of the investigation. Curry told investigators that McKenzie had confessed to him about killing Sarah Stern. But this wasn't just a casual admission. McKenzie had provided graphic details about how he had murdered her, describing the crime with a level of specificity that left no doubt about his involvement. What made Curry's testimony even more powerful was that he had managed to record some of these conversations. McKenzie, apparently feeling confident that Curry would never turn against him, had spoken freely about the murder, not realizing that his words were being captured on audio. The recordings were chilling. In them, McKenzie could be heard describing how he had strangled Sarah, how long it had taken her to die, and how he had watched her final moments. He spoke about the murder with a detachment that was deeply disturbing, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else rather than a crime he had committed with his own hands. McKenzie also discussed the money he had found in Sarah's home, expressing frustration that there hadn't been more. He talked about the disposal of her body as if it were a logistical challenge rather than the desecration of someone he had claimed to care about. These recordings provided investigators with the evidence they needed to make arrests. On February 1st, 2017, both Liam McKenzie and Preston Taylor were taken into custody and charged in connection with Sarah's murder. The arrest came as a shock to the Neptune City community. These weren't strangers or outsiders who had targeted Sarah. They were local young men who had grown up alongside her, who had been part of her social circle, who should have been her protectors rather than her killers. For Sarah's family, the arrests brought a mixture of relief and devastating pain. Relief because they finally knew what had happened to their daughter and sister, but pain because the truth was so much worse than they had imagined. The betrayal was almost as difficult to process as the loss itself. Following his arrest, Preston Taylor found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could maintain his loyalty to Liam McKenzie and risk spending the remainder of his life in prison, or he could cooperate with authorities and potentially reduce his sentence by testifying against the actual killer. Taylor chose cooperation, and in May 2017, he pleaded guilty to a series of charges related to his role in Sarah's murder and the subsequent cover-up. These charges included first-degree armed robbery, second-degree conspiracy, second-degree desecration of human remains, third-degree hindering apprehension of oneself, third-degree hindering apprehension of another, and fourth-degree tampering with evidence. As part of his plea agreement, Taylor agreed to testify against McKenzie and to assist investigators in understanding exactly what had happened on the night of December 2nd, too. He took officers to Sarah's house to recount the events of that night, walking them through the crime scene and explaining his role in the cover-up. Taylor's cooperation was crucial to the prosecution's case against McKenzie. While the recorded confessions provided powerful evidence, Taylor's first-hand testimony would fill in details and provide context that the recordings alone could not supply. However, Taylor's decision to cooperate didn't erase his culpability in Sarah's death. While he hadn't been the one to strangle her, he had made the conscious choice to help dispose of her body and create the fiction that she had committed suicide. His actions had prolonged her family's agony and nearly allowed her killer to escape justice. The prosecution made it clear that Taylor's cooperation, while appreciated, was not absolution. He would still face significant prison time for his role in the crime, though considerably less than he would have received if he had been convicted of first-degree murder alongside McKenzie. For the community of Neptune City, Taylor's confession confirmed what many had suspected but hoped wasn't true, that Sarah's death had been a betrayal by people she trusted. The details that emerged through his cooperation painted a picture of calculated cruelty that was difficult for those who knew all three young people to comprehend. Liam McKenzie's trial began in February 2019, more than 2 years after Sarah's murder. The courtroom was packed with family members, friends, and community members who had been waiting for justice for Sarah. The prosecution, led by experienced attorneys who understood the weight of their responsibility, presented a case that was both comprehensive and emotionally devastating. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the recorded confession that Anthony Curry had captured. Jurors listened in horrified silence as McKenzie's voice filled the courtroom, describing in his own words how he had killed Sarah Stern. The recordings were powerful not just because of what they revealed about the crime, but because of the casual tone in which McKenzie described taking a life. Preston Taylor took the witness stand to testify against his former friend and accomplice. His testimony provided crucial details about the events of December 2nd and the subsequent cover-up. Taylor described how McKenzie had called him after killing Sarah, how they had disposed of her body, and how they had staged the scene to look like suicide. The prosecution painted a picture of McKenzie as someone driven by greed who was willing to kill for money. They argued that he had planned Sarah's murder, executed it with cold calculation, and shown no remorse for his actions. The evidence supported every aspect of this narrative. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. The recorded confessions were damning, the physical evidence was strong, and Taylor's testimony provided first-hand corroboration of the prosecution's theory. They attempted to argue that the confessions were not reliable, that Taylor's testimony was motivated by his desire for a reduced sentence, and that the evidence did not conclusively prove their client's guilt. But the jury wasn't convinced by these arguments. The evidence against McKenzie was overwhelming, and the defense's attempts to create reasonable doubt fell flat. On February 27, 2019, after deliberating for just a few hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. McKenzie was convicted of first-degree murder, first-degree felony murder, first-degree robbery, second-degree conspiracy, and several other charges related to the crime and cover-up. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. On June 22, 2019, Liam McKenzie was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for desecration of human remains. The judge made it clear that McKenzie's crimes were among the most serious that could come before the court, involving not just murder but also the calculated betrayal of trust and friendship. During the sentencing hearing, McKenzie showed no remorse for his actions. He didn't apologize to Sarah's family, didn't express regret for his choices, and didn't acknowledge the pain he had caused. His lack of emotion in the face of such serious consequences spoke to the same coldness that enabled him to watch Sarah die. Preston Taylor was sentenced a week later, on June 28, 2019, to 18 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 85% of his sentence, meaning he would serve approximately 15 years and 10 months. During his sentencing, Taylor did offer an apology, saying, "I should have known better." However, Sarah's father, Michael Stern, was so disgusted by the brevity and apparent insincerity of the apology that he left the courtroom during Taylor's 2-minute statement. For the Stern family, the sentencing phase brought a measure of closure, but could never truly heal the wound left by Sarah's death. Michael Stern had lost his daughter to the greed and callousness of people she had trusted. No amount of prison time could bring Sarah back or undo the betrayal that had cost her life. The case also had a profound impact on the Neptune City community. Residents struggled to understand how two young men they had known and trusted could commit such a heinous crime against someone from their own tight-knit circle. The case forced difficult conversations about trust, friendship, and the hidden darkness that can exist even in people we think we know well. Sarah's body was never recovered from the Shark River, despite extensive search efforts by law enforcement and volunteers. This added an extra dimension of pain for her family, who were denied the closure that comes with being able to lay a loved one to rest properly. The river had claimed Sarah completely, leaving behind only memories and the devastating truth of how she died. The murder of Sarah Stern resonated far beyond the borders of Neptune City, becoming a case study in betrayal, greed, and the devastating consequences of moral failure. The story captured national attention, appearing on television crime shows and generating extensive media coverage that brought Sarah's story to audiences across the country. For those who study criminal behavior, the case offered troubling insights into how ordinary-seeming individuals can cross the line into unthinkable violence. McKenzie wasn't someone with an extensive criminal history or obvious warning signs of violent behavior. He was a young man from a small town who made a series of increasingly destructive choices that culminated in murder. The case also highlighted the crucial role that cooperation from accomplices can play in solving crimes and bringing killers to justice. Without Anthony Curry's decision to record McKenzie's confessions and bring them to authorities, the case might never have been solved. Similarly, Preston Taylor's eventual cooperation provided investigators with essential details about the crime and cover-up. Legal experts have pointed to the Sarah Stern case as an example of how modern investigative techniques, including the use of recorded conversations and digital evidence, can help solve cases that might have remained mysteries in earlier eras. The combination of traditional detective work and contemporary technology proved crucial in ensuring that Sarah's killers faced justice. The case also raised questions about the nature of friendship and trust, particularly among young adults. Sarah's willingness to trust people she had known since childhood ultimately cost her life, but that trust was a reflection of her character rather than a flaw to be criticized. The tragedy lies not in her trusting nature, but in the moral bankruptcy of those who exploited that trust. For the Neptune City community, healing has been a long and difficult process. The case shattered assumptions about safety and trust that had been fundamental to the community's identity. Residents have had to reconcile their memories of McKenzie and Taylor as local young men with the reality of what they were capable of doing to someone they claimed to care about. In the years since her death, Sarah Stern has been remembered, not for how she died, but for how she lived. Family and friends have worked to ensure that her memory is defined by her warmth, optimism, and genuine care for others, rather than by the violent circumstances of her death. Sarah had been someone who brought light into other people's lives. She was the friend who remembered birthdays, who offered encouragement during difficult times, and who celebrated others' successes with genuine enthusiasm. Her loss left a void in the lives of everyone who knew her, a reminder of how much impact one person can have on their community. The tragedy of Sarah's story is not just that her life was cut short, but that it was ended by people who should have been her protectors. The fundamental violation of trust that characterized her murder added an extra dimension of pain for those who loved her. It wasn't just that Sarah was gone. It was that she had been betrayed by people she had never thought to fear. In the aftermath of the case, some of Sarah's friends and family members have become advocates for victims' rights and have worked to support other families dealing with similar tragedies. Their efforts represent a way of honoring Sarah's memory by helping others navigate the difficult process of seeking justice for their loved ones. The case has also served as a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing warning signs in relationships and not dismissing concerning behavior as harmless quirks. While Sarah could never have predicted the extreme violence that McKenzie was capable of, there were indicators of his problematic thinking patterns that might have been more concerning if people had known what to look for. Sarah's story reminds us that evil can hide behind familiar faces, and that the people we trust most are sometimes capable of unthinkable betrayals. But it also reminds us of the importance of living with an open heart, as Sarah did, even in a world where trust can sometimes be misplaced. As we come to the end of Sarah's story, we're left with difficult questions about justice, friendship, and the nature of evil. Liam McKenzie sits in a New Jersey prison, serving a life sentence for his crimes. He will never again be free to harm another person, but his imprisonment cannot undo the damage he caused or restore what was lost. Preston Taylor continues to serve his sentence, carrying with him the knowledge of his role in Sarah's death and the betrayal of someone who had trusted him completely. His cooperation with authorities may have helped ensure that McKenzie faced justice, but it could never erase his complicity in the crime or the pain he caused Sarah's family. The Shark River continues to flow past the Route 35 bridge, carrying with it the memory of a young woman whose body was callously thrown into its waters by people she had considered friends. The bridge itself has become a memorial of sorts, a reminder of the thin line between safety and danger, trust and betrayal. For Sarah's father, Michael, and the rest of her family, life continues without the bright presence that Sarah had brought to their world. They carry her memory with them, honoring her not through the circumstances of her death, but through the celebration of her life and the love she shared with everyone around her. The case of Sarah Stern serves as a stark reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that trust, while essential to human connection, must sometimes be tempered with awareness and caution. It reminds us to treasure the people we love while we have them, and to never take for granted the simple gift of safety in our own communities. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Sarah not as a victim of violence, but as a young woman who lived with hope and kindness until her final day. Let her story serve as a reminder to approach life with both Sarah's openness to others and a healthy awareness of the complexity of human nature. The night is quiet now, and Sarah's story, though tragic, becomes part of the greater tapestry of human experience. A reminder of both the darkness we're capable of and the light we can choose to bring into the world. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care.